Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial video. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at something that's recently popped up as a popular trend, and that is we're taking a look at the Selector Connector model, and we're going to demystify that. This is the evolution of multiple IDs. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about. All right. As is the case with every field of endeavor, there are always ideas that sort of formulate out in that field, and then they sort of percolate up to the top, and then once somebody really fleshes them out and solidifies them into a cohesive, understandable model, people sort of grab onto that and hold on to it. I'm thinking about FileMaker 7 when it initially came out, and the introduction of table occurrences. If you weren't using FileMaker prior to FileMaker 7, then you know nothing about all of the multiple files that you had to have, and you had to basically connect those multiple files to each other, where each file directly represented its own table. It was at FileMaker 7 that tables became integrated into one single FileMaker file, but yet a lot of developers moving forward had to let go of some older baggage, things that they understood about how version 6 and earlier worked, and then apply a completely new model or metaphor in their mind. The same thing applies within FileMaker today. All the way in FileMaker 13, we have this notion of how a graph is designed. But these ideas that I'm going to explain have been coming from all kinds of different sources, but they're being popularized by a couple of people, in particular, Todd Geist, which is who we see on screen right here. And there's this pretty mug. And he has created an article about this. In fact, he talked about this at Pause on Error. Then he released a blog article. Then we also have Jason Young over at Seed Code with a much more exhaustive article with some pictures and explanations. Now, obviously, it would be pointless for me to go through all of these explanations because I'm going to show you my understanding of the what's now being called Selector Connector model and how it applies to you and to your solution. If your solution was not designed with the quote-unquote Selector Connector model, then there are some things that you can do in order to retrofit it so that it will work. Let's take a look at the file that Todd actually provided. So I'm giving credit where credit's due. Todd is popularizing this. You can find his article at this URL that you have on screen. That's at Geist Interactive, 2014, 11, 21, obviously in November. And you can read more about that here and also watch his video as well. As well, you can go to this URL over at seedcode.com/FileMaker-data-modeling-with Selector Connector. I'm not going to keep saying those dashes. You get the idea. Let's take a look at Todd's file and see what we're actually talking about with regards to how FileMaker actually works. All right. Now with Todd's file open, we can actually take a look at what this whole Selector Connector model means. Now, originally, Todd had called this UniversalContext, and I'm going to show you exactly why he called this UniversalContext. Now, the first thing is his file, if you're new to FileMaker, is very difficult to dig into because it is an amalgamation of all kinds of things, many different techniques, and in fact, the scripts is a collection of his popular modular FileMaker. Within the graph, he's also wired up a thing that he's got called master detail. He also has a technique and a completely separate thing called virtual list. Basically, all of these different things are things that if you don't already know about them are going to be very confusing with regards to what applies and what doesn't apply to Selector Connector and its explanation. I am going to break this down into the most simplest terms possible. Because FileMaker is what I call a ball of wax environment. In other words, everything that you're doing within FileMaker is all here within FileMaker. Let's contrast this. In other environments, you have many different technologies that are all segmented out into their own constituent parts. For example, a web application is composed of some type of language that actually creates the business logic of your solution. That would be, in FileMaker, scripts. But you also have logic within your calculations within your actual schema. So that's a little bit muddied right there. But in other environments, a database such as Oracle or Microsoft SQL or Postgres or MySQL, that database and all of its technology is pretty much segmented away from whatever technology is used in order to create and interact the logic that deals with the data stored in that database, which may be PHP or Perl or Python, Ruby, some popular language. That then in turn is also separated out from what is actually displaying all of the business logic. That happens to be the browser. And then the browser itself has its own JavaScript technology. So, as you can already tell, we've got a lot of different parts and pieces that all happen to be, by default, segmented out from each other. That's not the case in FileMaker. In FileMaker, we've got our schema directly here with regards to all of our tables that we're actually defining. Now, commingled within all of these tables are going to be tables that aren't specific to our data. For example, in Todd's database here, we have an items table, orders, customers, and order items, which is a join table. Now, these all clearly make sense. They are data tables storing the data relevant to what our solution is about, which presumably would be orders and invoices. But then we have all of these other tables which actually deal with the actual structure and design of your FileMaker database. Things like menu items, value lists that people can choose from, graphics that you actually add into your database in order to show. So what we have is we have this massive commingling of things within your FileMaker solution. And this commingling doesn't stop at just with the list of all of your tables. The commingling also extends into your fields and then further into your relationship graph. Now, as going all the way back that I can tell or remember from the time that FileMaker 7 came out, many different approaches to how you organize and design the structure, not just the pure interconnections for the purpose of how your data interconnects, but all of the connections that are represented here on the graph for the purpose of showing your user interface. There's multiple different approaches. One of the most popular is one that sort of falls in line with how people make sense of data, and that's been called Anchor Buoy, as we can see right here. Now, Anchor Buoy, if you don't already know, is simply a model that says, what is the structure of your data? If I have an order, then that order is obviously going to have items. If I have a customer, then that customer is obviously going to be connected in order to see their orders. But here on this particular graph, you can see that there is no connection from this customer's table occurrence to these orders. Yet, within this model, it is possible to see those orders specific, or those specifically belonging to a given customer. That's because in this notion, what happens is everything is pretty much connected to each other. And it's all done through a few dedicated tables and table occurrences. Now, the way that it's explained is that Todd broke it down into two different tables, one called connector and one called selector. His reasoning for doing this was basically modularity and segmenting things out. But from the standpoint of implementation, this could all be done with one single table. The whole premise is that this is a segmentation of all of the constituent parts that generate and drive how the user interacts with the data within your FileMaker solution. This is not a graph design based on your data modeling. This is based on solution interaction. So, if you already are familiar with FileMaker, then you're pretty well aware that you typically have a field, or multiple fields within your standard data table. So right here we have a customers table. This customers table has everything that we would associate, or not everything, but a lot of things that we would associate with a customer. A billing address, a company name, a contact, an email. The problem is when we start to design our FileMaker solution and we start to add on functionality that is going to allow the user to interact with all the different pieces of information that are spread throughout the database, we start to add these utility fields. And the utility fields, in most cases, are global fields. Now, according to FileMaker standards, we've designed some standards that says if the field is a data field, you're going to use a lower camel case. That means it immediately can be identified as a data field containing data relevant to your solution. If you're going to create a field that's going to be used for something that is driving the way that the solution actually works, the user interface, if it's a global field, then you're going to add a global field and it's going to be all caps. So in this case, one of the techniques that I tend to use is I create a field called create. It's typically a normal text field, and then I have options set onto that, which I just invoke with Command O, and I will simply set that setting to use global storage. Now here's the key thing to remember about global fields. Global fields only exist and are completely unique for each client that opens up a FileMaker solution, at least when it's hosted. If it's local, that's not the case. It's still there local to the file, but it'll get saved with the file. But on a hosted FileMaker file, a global field basically means that it's global, but only global for that user. Every other user has their own globals. Now, when you start to commingle a lot of these globals, let's say I've got create and then another field and another field and another field and another field, you can see right here that I'm jumping up in terms of the number of fields. And let's presume that all of these fields that I just duplicated all deal with individual and distinct little features, such as being able to pull down from a pop-up menu and be able to select from a certain list and have a portal filter out a certain number of customers based on a dollar amount that they've spent. All of these fields that I've added are fields that are being used in order to drive the user interface. The selector connector model basically says, I don't want to have all of these globals commingled with all of my data. I want a better organizational structure. And that's exactly what this does. Now, this has existed for a long time, using globals and being able to access them in other table occurrences rather than the table occurrence that represents your actual data. So basically what you're doing is you're taking all of these global fields that are used for the purpose of the user interface and interacting with the data, and you're putting them into another location. Now, when you put them into another location, many times you have to have access to these fields. This is pretty much the breakthrough that the selector connector has come up with. Not the fact that you can put globals into other locations, but the fact that if you do this through a dedicated table occurrence, which is pretty much a one record empty table that only uses global fields, it gives you this universal perspective that all other table occurrences can see all other table occurrences. Here, we'll take a look at what I'm actually talking about. I'll delete those fields, and you can see right here that this customers table, looking at the file, is extremely clean except for this one particular field, which doesn't happen to be capitalized according to our FileMaker standards that I would prefer, but it is a global field. When we take a look at the relationships on this graph, if you're to presume that everything down here at the bottom is all of your data model, all of your interconnected data model, how orders connect to order items, etc., everything that's above this, where you have this connector and this selector, you can see all of these Cartesian joins, all of these X's in between here. Now, a Cartesian, in the most simplest term, is basically just show me everything. It's also called a cross join. But by having one single field in all of these data tables within orders, items, customers, etc., you can create a cross join, or this Cartesian product, to this dedicated connector table. Now, when we look at the connector table, right here, you can see that it is quite clearly a one field, one record solution. Now, why does this become useful to you? Well, the reason that this is useful is that FileMaker, when you land onto a layout, so in other words, when I land onto this customer's layout, no matter which table occurrence it is, FileMaker has to evaluate all of the different connections and evaluate all of the different sets of data that needs to be displayed. So for example, within a portal, it needs to look at the relationship and says, what is the data that I need to display? Go get that data and then bring it back and show it into the portal. Now, if the portal has a filter on it, what data do I need to filter out so that I actually don't show it onto the user interface? So it's pretty much a two-stage process. If we go back to the graph and we take a look at this and think about it, if all of these table occurrences, no matter if there were 10, 50, or 100, if all of them were based on global fields, and that global field only exists for each individual client, and if that global field is empty, does FileMaker have to do any work? Quite simply, the answer is no. So there's very little performance cost to actually having all of these cross-join relationships when they're based on global fields and those global fields are empty. FileMaker can do this within microseconds. It could go through 100 different table occurrences, all connected based on globals, and say, nothing to evaluate. 500 times. No big deal. Easy cheesy. It'll breeze right through it. If you do have a data value that's within the global field, then of course you can get at the data that you want. So that's fundamentally the principle here. The principle is, if I connect my customers through a cross-join relationship, that cross-join relationship then, in this case, connects to another cross-join relationship, which in this case, Todd has broken this up into two different table occurrences. Granted, this will work if you only had the connector itself. But again, Todd has mentioned that he does this for modularity, and I'll let you go read his article and reasoning why. But within the connector, or in this case, the selector, so we're going through two. In this case, let's look at customers. We're going from customers up to the connector, over to the selector, and then we're able to look at other connections of relationships. So whatever value is within a global field, within a dedicated table, regardless of whether it's connector or selector, but in this case it's stored within selector, that table occurrence all the way down here can actually see what that selection is. But it's not just this table occurrence. It's all other table occurrences by virtue of the fact that they're all connected through the connector. So whatever customers can see based on a global field that's stored within selector, whatever that value is and whatever it's connected to, orders can see it as well. That's what makes this particular model so advantageous. Now, when you combine in other techniques, such as virtual lists, which is very powerful to use and understand, it will keep this graph extremely clean. I don't actually need to have any type of table occurrence connected to customers in order to see that customer's specific orders, as long as I can put that customer's ID somewhere. And that comes in the form of the selector. If we take a look at the selector table, you're going to see all of these global fields. Look at them right here. We have ID underscore customer. It is a text global field. We have ID underscore item, which is a global field, a main menu, an order item. So basically, this whole system is built on the premise that rather than maintaining and using the context based on where the user is on the layout they are on, if I want to see data, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that through one centralized table occurrence. That happens to be connector, and that's what Todd was calling UniversalContext. Now let's take a look at the actual implementation of this. What I have is I've got a graph, or a picture of the graph, so that we can take a look over here and I can draw and show you what I do as I work within Todd's file to show you why this is such a cool model if you're going to retrofit your own FileMaker solution. Let's take a look. Okay, so let's break things down and do a little bit of markup on this graph that I have an example of. Now, as I mentioned towards the beginning, in order for me to be on a customer's layout, which is what we're on right here, and have that customer be able to see all of their orders, in your typical anchor buoy, you would actually have that connected by a table occurrence which would be hanging off of the customer's table. Now, there is nothing wrong with doing that, and this model does not promote that you abandon the actual data structure that we have right here that would conveniently show us all of the orders that that particular customer has made. But if you use execute SQL and you use virtual list, you would, on customers, at the point in time that you landed on a customer using maybe an on layout or on record load trigger, you would be able to load all of the orders for that customer. Basically only showing the data when the actual data is needed, not actually maintaining a persistent connection of all of those orders to that customer. Now, it's sort of a bad example because you probably would always want to persist a connection between customers and orders in order to always show that. But let's take a look at what the advantage is of by going through all of these Cartesian product joins from the perspective of what customers can see as opposed to what orders can see about any given selected customer. That's what we're going to take a look at. Now, because of the fact that everything is connected, that means that any one table occurrence, whatever it stores and whatever connection it has, can be seen by all other table occurrences. So right now, we're taking this example of customers. Customers is basically a layout where it's based on the customer's table, the same base table that you would expect. If I switch over here to FileMaker, clear that, and go into my layout mode and go up to my layouts and go to my layout setup, I can see that in Todd's file, the customer's layout is based on a customer's table occurrence. That is the table occurrence that we see over on the graph right here. Now, what happens if we have a customer that for some odd reason is interacting or does interact with another customer? Well, if we take that table occurrence, this customer's right here, and by the fact that it's connected through the Cartesian join right here, it can see through the connector into this other table occurrence called Selector, and within Selector, there happens to be a dedicated field for storing a customer ID, which in this case, we can see right here, all of these table occurrences named selected. Out of that, one of them is named customer. So this table occurrence right here of selected customer is connected to this table occurrence, which is Selector, which is pretty much a blank, empty table, one record with global fields. But within that global field, we can take a ID from the customer's table. This is the perspective that we're on right here. We can take an ID, whatever that ID is, and what happens is it gets pushed through this connection into the global field in the selector. Now, what happens is by the mere fact that orders is also connected through this connector and through the selector, whatever value is stored within that global field can be seen equally as well within orders as it can within customers, as well as any other table occurrence that's connected within items as well. It's pretty much a universal viewpoint of whatever customer is currently selected. Now, the cool thing about this is the way that a user uses a database. When a user is dealing with a customer, they're dealing with that one customer. As soon as they're finished, they switch to another customer. So as far as their perspective is concerned, it doesn't matter whether the customer's table is actually storing 10,000 different customers. Everybody only deals with one thing at a time. You really only can. So that's what we're going to take a look at with regards to how this actually works out. And it's really pretty simple. This table occurrence right here, selected customers, can be a portal that is actually displaying on any of these table occurrences down here, which is all of my data structure. So basically think about this. Everything above this line deals with the user interface of this solution and how that user interface is implemented. Rather than having it commingled within the data structure of all of my tables, it's all separated out up into the top. But what makes this cool is that you don't have all of these extra table occurrences spread throughout all of the rest of your solution in order to replicate functionality. Because you've universally connected to this one table occurrence through this cross join, it can see all other functionality, including virtual lists, including menus, including graphics. All of these things can be universally seen by all of these table occurrences, which are my data structure down here at the bottom. That's what makes this so cool. So let's take a look and implement it directly within the user interface as I clear things out right there by going onto our customer's layout, which I'm already in layout mode, and we're simply going to go up to this graph right here. Now remember, we are on this table occurrence right here. We're on customers, but we want to be able to see a portal from the item that's all the way up here, from the selected customer. That's no problem. We can definitely do that. So over here in FileMaker, I can make a portal, and that portal is simply going to be based on selected customer. And we'll go over here and we'll add, let's say, for example, the email address. So I have this table occurrence called selected customer, and I'm on my customer's layout. Now, every item within your database has something that's unique to it, and that's typically an ID field. So when we look at this ID field for this customer, let's go into browse mode, and we'll actually need to change the data formatting for that to as entered. But this is the unique number that identifies this particular customer. This number can be copied, because everything is interconnected, into this selector table. So we'll go into our layout mode and we'll actually add a copy of the field. But the copy of the field that we're going to look at is within the selector table. Here we have all of our global fields. Now we can't tell according to FileMaker standards that they are global fields because they're not capitalized. However, the actual name of the table occurrence is capitalized. So then maybe that's a little clue to Todd. I would actually capitalize these myself to know that they are key values. But this key value right here. So through some type of scripting process or thereabouts, it would be possible on any of my layouts that the user is actually able to see things, whether I'm on the orders layout right here, or whether I'm on the items table for some reason, or whether I'm on the customers. It doesn't matter where I'm at. The selection of a given user is simply a matter of pushing whatever customer ID I want up through the connector into the selector, into a global field, and then I'm able to use a portal from any of these items on any of my table occurrences. Extremely powerful. And again, like I stated at the very beginning of this video, if I don't want any type of connection to exist, then I simply won't have a connection exist because the global value can be empty and nothing is evaluated. But we can see right here that we are currently on this customer named Geneva Kaplan. Geneva Kaplan right here. We can see that this is her ID. But as I switch to another person, I can see that this ID is different. Now here we can see that Geneva, there's her email that I put into this selected selector table occurrence. If I simply change that ID, then of course it would change now to Kurt Morgan, to Kurt L. Morgan. The cool thing is, watch what happens when I take a copy of this portal looking through that selector table occurrence, and I simply copy it, and I'm going to go to a layout that is orders. Now, because everything is all interconnected, when I paste this onto my layout, first off, I don't have any problems because everything is connected. And when I go into browse mode, I can see that no matter what order I'm on, when I switch, the selected customer from a universal perspective is still Kurt. There is no other selection, but this gives me a lot of advantages in terms of how I interact and work with my data. Not only does it keep the graph much more clean because I don't have to have a table occurrence hanging off of each of my table occurrences right here for each of the times that I need to access anything from a universal perspective. I simply go through my dedicated table occurrence or through my dedicated table occurrence of my connector. And in this case, Todd's segmenting things out and he's making one called selector, and I can access anything else within the whole solution. That means any customer data, which is right here, or any utility or functionality that may be something that I've baked into my FileMaker solution, such as graphics, such as a menu, such as here we have this back and forth system that Todd's built into this. As I said, Todd has a lot of things built into this in order to showcase this functionality, and so it's very easy to become confused. But basically, this is the core of what's going on. I should clear that out. This is the core of what's going on. The fact that we have all of those connections, those cross joins between all of the different tables, which is my data model down at the bottom, and then the rest of my interaction. All of that, because it's all connected, gives me access to a lot of things that normally are all hanging off of all of your table occurrences down here, and you start to end up with this really crazy graph down at the bottom just in order to access and show data within the user interface that now you don't really need to do that if you're going to implement the selector connector. All right, so as I wrap this video up, there's only a few things that you need to keep in mind and be aware of with regards to this particular model and how FileMaker presents and interacts with data. Obviously, if it's not on the layout, such as this portal, if there's a portal that is connected through any number of relationships, whether they're Cartesian or not, if that portal exists and it does need to show data, FileMaker would have to queue that data up, look for the data within FileMaker server, transfer it across the network, and it does it typically for whatever's displayed within the portal, plus an additional 25 items is what I've heard. Now, when it has to load a record, it has to load everything that's in that record. It does not load just the pieces of information that you see, such as just this name, just this number, this zip code, and this state. No, it loads everything with regards to all fields that are in that particular record. So if you want a fast-performing FileMaker solution, you want to create what are known as narrow tables. Also, specifically with this particular model, the fact that you're segmenting out your globals into dedicated tables, which that's all this model really is. When we go into define database and when we look at our tables, even though Todd has created all of these tables, if you look at most of them, such as the customer's utility, you will see a collection of global fields. If you look at the orders utility, a collection of global fields. If you look at the connector, you will see a single global field. If you look at the selector, you will see only global fields. All of these dedicated table occurrences, whether you create multiple tables or not. Now, Todd has opted to create multiple tables. You don't have to, if you don't want to, create a table called connector and create a table called selector and create a table called items utility, orders utility, customers utility, etc. If your personal preference with regards to management of the organization of your FileMaker database says, well, I can put all utility fields and selection fields within one single table occurrence called connector, then you can certainly do that. The mere fact that all of these fields are global fields comes down to the perspective of how do you want to organize them. My assumption is, without having spoken to Todd, that he likes to separate all of these out into dedicated and isolated tables just for the purpose of being able to make sense of the organization. It makes it easier to understand when you go into the graph what that particular table is actually doing. The selector table, for example, manages selections that are made within your whole FileMaker solution. The items utility table is maintaining data that the user puts in relevant to working on that particular layout for that table. Good case in point. He has a field called ZG QuickFind. Now, if we go over to the orders utility, we're going to see yet another ZG QuickFind. My personal preference would be that I would actually have this be some other way where I might use just one QuickFind field, and then when I enter onto a new layout, actually just swap that out with a value that I might be storing within a global variable instead of a global field, because I have a number of QuickFind fields. But again, that's just a matter of preference with regards to how things are actually going to be organized from the standpoint of the developer. So there you have it. There is my explanation, thanks to the wonderful file provided by Todd Geist, and also thanks to Jason Young for basically documenting this technique. This technique, if you were to break it down to its fundamental, is simply using Cartesian product joins in order to segment out your global fields, which are used to drive the user interface and all of what it does. That's quite simply what it is. This is an organization method for the FileMaker graph because everything within FileMaker is one giant ball of wax. And making sense of it is almost just as important as how good your data structure actually is. Being able to distinguish what's your user interface and what is the business logic of your FileMaker solution versus what is the data structure of how the data is stored is very important, especially in a very large FileMaker solution. So what should you do if you already have a FileMaker solution, you're currently using some other method, or you're using something like Anchor Buoy? Well, the easiest way to retrofit your FileMaker solution is to simply take the knowledge from this video and Todd's video and the article written by Jason and say, how do I want to approach this? And simply look at all of the individual features and functionality provided by your solution. If your solution has a particular search functionality and you have a dedicated search field within all of your tables, approach that one aspect and simply say, I'm going to create a dedicated table occurrence or a dedicated table and table occurrence. You can call it connector if you want, or call it something else. And then you're going to start to put global fields within that. And the caveat is you can only put global fields within whatever the dedicated table and table occurrence is. You cannot put any field that is not global. Otherwise, what will happen is you might actually end up doing record locking, and that record locking is now associated to the functionality of your FileMaker solution. So for any of those table occurrences that are here in the system, not all of them, but many of them where the user makes selections or interacts with things, you're typically only ever going to have globals. Only globals within connector. Only globals will exist within selector, and only globals will end up being within these utility fields. But you'll notice that there is also some data fields that deal with the logic of your solution, such as this main menu. When you look at the menu, you're going to see regular fields, index fields, in fact, because those fields, for the purpose of accessing the menu, have to be indexed so that the portal can actually show them. How you store these globals is completely up to you, but the documentation about the selector connector model, again, thanks to Todd and Jason, has now been fleshed out so that you can go forth and make your solution much more streamlined in terms of its graph organization. And again, to retrofit, just take certain features and work on those one at a time, moving the fields that are global from within your data tables into dedicated tables and connecting to them through Cartesian product joins. That's really all that you have to do in order to take advantage of this very effective model. So I hope, as with all things, you've learned more about what you can do with FileMaker. I wish you much luck with your own FileMaker solution, and until next time, happy FileMaking.